Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Debatable, specifically the post debate analysis we are making for Debatable Open 2024. With me today is our media motion set contributor, Charlie Vitug.
Thank you, thank you. It's nice to be here. It's nice to be back, I guess.
Charlie was one of our debatees. She worked with us in several projects before, so we're very, very happy to have them over as a motion contributor for this tournament. We have really interesting motions, the first of which is a nice little spin on motions about televised trials, but here it's more about arbitration. It's about reality TV. So it's not about the law per se. It's more about how it interfaces with media. So the first motion reads, this House regrets arbitration-based reality court shows. Now, Charlie, could you tell us a bit more about what inspired this motion for you?
Yeah, a lot of these shows have existed for a really long time. We've been seeing snippets of them that have also been becoming really, really popular on like short form video apps like TikTok and Reels. And that's mostly because there is a lot of drama to them. And if anything, I think that's like what makes these videos so addicting, right? It's being able to witness the drama in people's lives because we know these are real people. But at the same time, it takes the nature of a reality show where these are people we know who are real, but the way at which the story is told is manipulated. And I think what's so dangerous about the manipulation is that it's on a case to case basis. We don't know to what extent it is over dramatized, and we don't know to what extent it is accurate. I guess that's just like, a debate we've probably had before in many different forms, but this one's just a little bit more specific.
What I will say about this is a reality TV show that tries to simulate a courtroom setting. It's true that probably a lot of it is manipulated because I can tell you from experience that in real life, courtroom proceedings can be boring, especially if like you go to court and then you spend 2 hours waiting for your case to be called and it turns out like it gets moved 2 or 3 months later. Whereas arbitration based reality TV is really fast, like the entire issue gets resolved. So, with respect to how it's manipulated, Charlie, what I want to ask you here is, especially for Gov's side, how would you frame or how would you describe these kinds of manipulations to increase the drama, so to speak?
Honestly, I think it could be really bad. Like, it's kind of like a documentary, I'd say, where in documentaries, the general rule of thumb, where if you want to be ethical, is to get an equal amount of sound bites from both sides of the issue. Whereas in these TV shows, which are really meant for entertainment and not, informing the audience, which I think is the Gov way to frame it, then they don't have to do that. They can get maybe like a lot of the slip ups of the defendant. A lot of the time, it's probably, I guess, like there's a decision to make as to who do you want to make it look like slipped up. Will it be the woman? Will it be a person from a minority or something? Which obviously are really, really bad, right? So yeah, I think like it's those types of manipulations where it's a lot of editing. You leave things out to an extent, maybe your words will be twisted. At the same time, I think it's also just adding just the unnecessary emotion that makes it annoying to watch if you were someone who is actually involved in the issue. Just, with scoring, like musical scoring, that would turn it into clearly something meant for television when really this is something that could really take a toll in your life if you were to be involved.
With respect to like the editing out of certain portions to make someone look better, to make another person look worse, what I would say there is a lot of judges in real life, in actual courtrooms, they do that as well. When they write their decisions, they sort of editorialize as well. Like they only focus on the facts that support their decision. And to some extent, they might deprioritize or like completely leave out in some unfortunate cases some details that are brought up by the other party. So my question now is if the risk of editorializing or like leaving some stuff out can also happen in a court, why is it uniquely harmful in the context of reality TV?
I guess like when you have someone do that in the court setting, I'd say what makes it different from this show is really like the whole essence of trying to entertain people and making a profit out of it. You want to make them look like they're in such a terrible position a lot of the time because that's how drama is. I think the way you want to frame drama is You want it to look like they're very high stakes. For example, paternity court, a lot of the time it's really the kid at stake. Or maybe there are some court shows where it's about how much child support to pay, or just generally how much do you owe someone, right? I think that's something that's a key element of drama, high stakes. Also, I think it's like, what's the word for this? Having a lot of people watching you this time. I honestly think that's a big, big effect. And even if court trials that aren't televised are still public, I think when you have this to a subscription network with a regular following, that's a whole nother story. So yeah.
So I suppose that for Go, the main part of the argument, especially for the first speaker, would be about why that publicity aspect can be traumatizing for the people involved. So can you describe to me what kind of impact would this kind of bad publicity lead to? For example, if you are in a position where you lost the televised simulated courtroom trial.
Yeah, so I actually really like that tie back to the fact that these are real people. I think that's the strongest premise that you could make on government. And these are real day to day people who aren't public figures. They don't really owe us any less privacy that we need to know a lot of things about their life. And at the same time, because we don't know them, this is our very first introduction to them. And other than this manipulation, I think even in the best case that there's minimal manipulation, it's just the fact that I think the court setup can really just bring out parts of ourselves who aren't ourselves on a daily basis, if that makes sense. Especially in like court cases, which would involve the child again, or like a lot of money, or in general, something that you care about a lot, and that's why you are in court, right? So yeah, in general, I think it's like a poor introduction to these people. And given again what I mentioned earlier, where how snippets of these shows have reemerged, even if a lot of these shows are done, is because of how active like these short form video content platforms are. So TikTok, Reels, all of these are publishing these people. At the same time, it makes it so accessible to come and find these people. And again, just going back to other reality shows again, I guess like even how X Factor has manipulated some of their contestants with like terrible attitudes to audition or something. Even if these happened in like 2010 or something, a lot of people still go back on the internet and, you know, just go back to these people's profiles. They comment on them a lot, they bully them a lot. And I guess like that's just not something you'd want to do. And because of these court shows, it's kind of like a given that that would probably happen because these people have been following your life because they are invested.
In fact, that's part of the draw, isn't it? Like you, as a producer, if you're a producer on that show, you would really want to have like really sensational characters. Like, sorry, not characters. These are real people. But like Gen X Factor. So I remembered American Idol and how in the early years, in the earlier seasons of American Idol, one of the huge draws for of that show was Simon Cowell just being really, really mean, and that might be really bad for those people with respect to their reputation. But my next question is, what would Gov say if, let's say, opposition responded to the privacy and reputation argument saying like, well, you agreed. You agreed to be on this show. You took on that risk and now you're mad at us because that risk didn't really, pan out in your favor. How do you imagine Gov would respond to that?
I guess it's probably on a case to case basis again. I can imagine government giving multiple frames to this. So, I guess like a government can say that because it's probably them wanting public opinion or like a public platform to tell their story, and that there are trade offs. And they might have been aware of those trade offs, but it doesn't necessarily justify the harm that is done. So, for example, the trade off to that is that there is uncontrolled public opinion. It doesn't necessarily justify to what that public opinion has reached in the long term. So, for example, I think, again, these shows are done, but these are re-emerging online because of how people are, how invested people are. And honestly, I think the platforms which they're popular on are such cruel, cruel platforms. And that's why, like, one of the motions in this motion set is also about TikTok, right? So yeah, I think that's one thing where you know the stakes, but in terms of how far it'll go, a lot of the time you're under the impression that it won't lead to that. And if it does, then obviously that's an unethical thing.
I think another angle that you could see here is who are the types of people who would go to these types of arbitration based reality court shows. Most probably, if they had money, they could afford an arbitrator who like kept things private, kept things confidential. So what I would say is for a lot of these people, they had nowhere else to go. They couldn't afford a lawyer, they couldn't afford, the fees that are associated with filing a case in court. So they had nowhere else to turn to aside from Judge Judy or paternity court, right? And so if you look at the claims for child support in paternity court, a lot of the time these are really big amounts, right? So I would say maybe Gov can also kind of respond by saying that consent might have been vitiated due to their poverty or something like that. But
Yeah, yeah.
which brings the burden to opposition to respond to that. So, how do you imagine opposition defending the rise, or how do you imagine opposition defending arbitration based reality court shows?
Yeah, so I think for one, it's the comparison of what other people would resort to without these. I know a lot of people in support of these court shows talk about how it's information as to how these trials actually go, especially in the case where these are actually conducted by lawyers and, anyone who's actually licensed to do so. So, yeah, and I think that's where there is a bit of tie back to this whole idea where the alternative is court trials are public, but people don't really watch them unless they're for some like high profile celebrity or something, right? I think it's also when you say they just frame it as a way of like incentivizing people to learn one way or another. It's not the most accurate way, but at the very least, like there's you know, some sense of being informative. I think I also wrote something down here where there's also just like the rise has led to less dramatized court trials, which are just more raw in nature. Where I think one of the older ones is Judge Judy, which is like I think one of the most criticized ones because of how dramatized it was. And then eventually from there, in order to compete against Judge Judy, they ended up making less and less dramatic ones, which were arguably showing equal amounts from both sides of a dispute. So I think that's one thing where there's more incentive for them to, I guess, be accurate, if that makes sense. And in general, I think it's the framing of like tying back to the whole informative thing, where people should be aware of how this works, of how court trials work, but at the same time, I guess acknowledging that not everyone's going to go through that effort unless it's something that they don't find boring. I think the fact that anyone can find themselves in court one day might be a bit of a push. You can frame it as something informative. And it's just better than other alternatives. Like, I guess the same people who would be invested into this are the same people who would probably be invested into Tulfo. Or maybe in other countries, these are the same people who would be invested into suits or something. And neither of these show accurate, court proceedings. So yeah.
Yeah, that does make sense. I actually really like the educational aspect or the informational aspect that you were talking about because I think the info slide and the motion itself talks about trying to simulate court trials. So they get a lot of their legitimacy from how closely they mirror courtrooms and actual trials without the hassle of having to wait 3 months for the next update and like that hearing eventually being postponed or canceled and stuff like that. So I suppose like that could be a really good way to dip your toes in the legal system, so to speak. But more than that, Charlie, the next thing I wanted to ask you is how do you weigh these benefits? Like this is an alternative that they could have, and this could be very informational for some people. How do you weigh that against the harm that was presented by Gov with respect to privacy concerns, how bad TikTok and shorts will make it out to be for the real people who are involved in these cases. How do you weigh that?
So I guess it's just like painting the harms of after you prove that they really wouldn't be informed of how this whole court process works, definitely. Where I think something I've just noticed in the last few years is that there are a lot of people who explain things and don't actually understand them. And when they explain things, the sources are always like TV shows. Their sources are always maybe news articles that they read the headline of, but not actually like the article of. I think when there's more incentive for them to follow something, you can argue that that's much better. At the end of the day, I think opposition also has room to say that you can't assume on government that the majority of people in these court trials would be subject to online bullying or something, especially when, you know, I guess like especially when it is only certain cases that get attention, or when just the fact several years have passed, or the fact that there are so many cases that they're taking on and that are televised, that what are the chances yours would be, you know, the eye of attention? Or maybe even what you mentioned earlier, where a lot of these aren't high profile cases. A lot of the time, these are day to day people with day to day problems that unfortunately have to exist in marriages or something. I think that's where OP has room to say that you can't assume the harm will be as extreme as Gov paints it out to be. And yeah, honestly, I don't think the way to go about this motion is to name as many pros or cons as you can, but just to prove as much as you can. Because I think it's a very, no pun intended, but like debatable framing.
It is a debatable type of framing. But I want to pick your brain for an extension. What kind of extensions can you imagine here?
Yeah, so and Gov, to regret this, I think it's a lot of just the strings attached that you aren't able to escape. So for example, I guess with paternity court, it's just a matter of like framing it where you're not the only person involved here. Yeah, it's probably like two spouses, but then maybe their kid growing up, right? I think in paternity court there are some episodes or maybe some other court show where they literally have one screen focused on the baby in like some basket or something. And yeah, I just can't imagine being someone who was dragged into that because of other people. And then suddenly this whole thing being broadcast on television and following me for the rest of my life. Personally, that's what I felt when I watched one of the court shows and I saw like a kid there. I think they show kids quite often actually. And a lot of them are like fairly newborn, less than a year old. I guess it's a matter of framing how, like, to what extent these court shows have reached. So is this something people revisit all the time or something? I do think that if it's that case, then because this is like snippets of these have become so accessible online, there might be a discussion about how it's become so easy to look at where these people are right now. Where like I guess it makes it easier to check back up on these people, to raise more discussions about these people, especially with how these algorithms work or something, and just put more attention to, whether they're actually granted justice.
Yeah, kaya you should never make content out of your kids, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Bunch
Just
of TikTokers just like, oh, my kid is doing something silly. Like, can you imagine how messed up it might be if that kid like grows up or like lives in a world and like people know them for dumb things that they did as a baby and stuff like that. But moving on to the second motion, the second motion in the set is this house believes that media outlets should not report on the private lives of politicians. My question here is from the outset is what would you consider private, right? Like,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, because the debate I imagine is it's a blurry line for politicians, what is considered private and what is not considered private. So how do you imagine the teams will be framing this concept of private, considering that line is very blurred with respect to politicians?
Yeah, so that whole thing about privacy is a fundamental right, but like not a qualified right, I think is the term for it, is I guess the entire framing that they give on government, where everyone does deserve a level of privacy, but because you're a politician, then there is a lot of public information that should be demanded of you because you do have a lot of power over how the law works and how people live their lives. So definitely I think the advantage on Gov is that you do have a lot of room to frame that what is considered private to others shouldn't be considered private to politicians. Although I do think what the discussion is definitely going to be considered private on both sides is this whole idea of, I guess, something more personal to them, maybe like intimate relationships, their sexuality, stuff like that. And I think again, things which can be considered public, but for a day-to-day person, it is very much fair to call it private. So yeah, I think like a few things that I'd want to just mention here, which we can dive into later, is I remember reading this article during, I think it was written during the election for George W. Bush. It was called like "Why I Outed Gay Republicans" or something. And a lot of the people voting against like same-sex marriage were actually people in same-sex relationships and stuff like that. And I guess it's also a discussions on how when you do allow the media to report on the private lives of individuals, who will be targeted here? Is it probably Republicans who, I don't know, maybe might be concealing a lot of information to the public about their taxes or something? Or is it going to be like women and them, I guess, and their past relationships or alleged affairs with other people or something, because that's how the media works, being a profit driven corporation at the end of the day. So, yeah, I think, again, it's a whole mess of like what is considered private and public, but I think that's, I guess, the whole essence of the debate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I remembered like Laila de Lima when when she was being attacked in Congress. Huge portions of those hearings were specifically just about her having relations with like I think it was a driver, right? And it's really weird as as a feminist, as a person who follows, Philippine politics, it's really weird to see that again there really is a predilection towards the more sensational aspects of whatever it is you could be reporting. So instead of like the more boring stuff about, like how taxes work, it's much easier and more entertaining to focus on, oh, they do cocaine, oh, they have sex, oh, they what other things? Oh, they're secretly gay, right? But I also really like the point that you made that it's possible that people who will be targeted are themselves parts of minorities. Like they could be women, they could also be gay, etc. So for Gov, how would you weigh that harm, right? Because and I imagine on Gov, the harm that you're talking about here is with respect to their privacy, right? Like they're losing a huge chunk of their private lives. How would you weigh that against an argument coming from opposition about how look, sometimes it really, really is relevant to talk about who you have sex with. Because if you're running on a platform where you want to remove rights from gay people, then it is relevant if people find out you're a hypocrite because you're yourself also gay. Or you also have, affairs on the side if you're, talking about the sanctity of marriage and stuff like that. So how would you weigh that against the argument from opposition about accountability?
Yeah, so I think with government, it's really essential to prove that the private life of a politician can be separate from their public political life, where reporting on their private lives might even overshadow more important content about maybe their professional approach, such as their experiences and like their platforms as well, especially when they're up for a position and we're deciding whether to trust them with that position during election. So yeah, I think that's another thing to consider in terms of like weighing that against op, which would say, yeah, where op could say that we do like these things are valued, especially in times of voting. I think how Gov could do that is to say that even if these are valued, is it the most valuable thing to be talking about? And it's just framing the media as, I'd say, like as a limited space where, yeah, there are so many articles popping up, but only a specific amount would get that attention from people or would get that discussion. And admittedly, given just how absurd politics can be sometimes, I think people are more likely to look at the more like I wouldn't say drama aspect of these issues, but like more scandalous aspects of news articles. So yeah, in the sense that like the more you put out, the more content is overshadowed and how that affects discourse. So yeah.
You can kind of argue on Gov that it doesn't actually get accountability. It creates a mob mentality instead, right? So would this be a good example? Would the example of Kate Middleton having cancer be a good example here? Because what happened with Kate Middleton was, if I'm not mistaken, she posted a photo of herself with her kids, and it was obviously Photoshop. And there were so many conspiracy theories about it. It turns out that she had cancer, and they were trying to hide that. So, would it be a good way for Gov to argue this point where they say because the media keeps reporting on the private lives of public figures, especially members of the royal family or politicians, it creates like this need to constantly update people on their private lives. And there is a perverse incentive now to fake stuff. And there's also a perverse incentive to make matters worse when, a person is just trying to be private because they have cancer or they have a sickness, but the media is trying to make it appear like, oh, this is the next Princess Diana. Would that be a good thing for Gov to say here?
Think they can say it. I just think there's a lot of room for op to say it's not something they're doing out of burden to be like public or something. I think them doing that is probably more believable to be framed as a form of strategy about what information is let out. And ultimately, strategy is something that benefits them at the end of the day, where op could easily bring up other information which is concealed from the public, which that would be very, very relevant when it ties back to taxes, when it ties back to allegations about how you treat your workers or like people you've been in past relationships with and stuff like that. So I honestly think, at least in debate world, that it'll be easier to dispute an op.
Yeah, that does make sense. So if it's easy to dispute on all, what would you say would be a really, really strong argument for Gov where you are able to say that, like it's not just about accountability. There are other ways to get accountability aside from outing a gay Republican. Like what alternative would be provided by Gov in this respect?
I think if there's a way to build, I guess, more engagement platforms, I don't know a better word, but I think it's a matter of, I guess, like politics at the end of the day being something that is very volatile, where even politicians themselves are scared of revealing information to the public. I think that says a lot. And therefore, what that leads to is like, I guess the most ideal world that you'd want rather is where these are things that wouldn't be taken against them. And the prerequisite to that is having, like stronger democracy at the end of the day. And what Gov does here is to prove how this just leads to democracies getting weaker and weaker, where because they are profit driven, again, they are incentivized to report on what causes scandal at the end of the day. So yeah, you can't achieve that prerequisite of having a stronger, democratic structure. And at the end of the day, because media has partisan interests, and just kind of straying away from the question here a bit, they do have certain political leanings that affect what information they report on. So I guess even if all the reports were to be factual at the end of the day, it could still be one sided. Similar to what we talked about court trials manipulating the perspective earlier. Media does have the same power when it comes to covering private information about politicians. So yeah, I think that's definitely something to consider. How do you achieve a stronger democracy? And I guess just like another argument that I'm thinking of in government is how this type of media attention discourages a lot of credible people from going for these leadership positions. And instead, we just end up getting power hungry people in these positions as well. Where I guess it would be nice to have more women in politics, but the media would target them. So yeah, I think that's just like a few things to consider on Gov.
That's actually a great point. And I don't think that you were straying because I really was gonna ask next about like how would this affect media as an institution and also like politics as an institution. So I think that's a really strong argument for Gov, right? Like you're going to see less women running for positions of power or in politics because the risk that you're taking on where like it's very likely that someone will try to slut shame you or try to shame you into silence, that might be a very, very real possibility for these candidates, right? But for opposition, I would like to ask you the same thing, right? How can you argue like that you're still gonna have, women, people of color running or like make them safer and stuff like that? How will this affect those people?
Well, I think if the media doesn't report on them, there's still a lot of room for them to voluntarily put this information in their public campaigns. So I think this is where private information becomes public. Sorry, personal information becomes public knowledge in the sense that you put it part of your platform. You are a gay man fighting for, reproductive rights or something for the LGBT community and stuff like that. I think that's something to, I guess, like frame also how this information transforms when you are the one offering this information. It's not to say that it doesn't get out there at all, but rather now it's coming from you. And I think that also gives you like a certain power to the discussion because when you offer information, I think that's when media outlets become much more willing to approach you for information, for interviews, as opposed to spark this scandal or something. I guess this time you're ahead of the scandal. So yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say like get ahead of the scandal. And so
Yeah.
those gay Republicans are in the closet, right? Like they're less likely to be complete hypocrites about it because they don't want to be scandalized. So it's more likely that they're gonna live authentic lives. It's more likely that they're gonna be more progressive or at the very least not regressive and stuff like that. But with respect to the third motion is this House would ban TikTok in the US. So this is an ongoing issue, right?
Yeah.
And I remember you were telling me, like, can you wait until the so and so update in the TikTok thing before we record the post debate analysis? So, what I want to ask you is, what is the update? Because I know Nina is very updated on this, but I am not updated on this.
Yeah, it's funny because I look back on the news about it every now and then. And even until yesterday, I was like, okay, so there's still no final decision about it. But based on just like all the votes that there have been so far, there's no full ban yet. But honestly, I think this motion should exist independent of what's happening right now in the case, just because of the nature of TikTok as a whole. I think there have been a lot of ethical concerns for years to come now. And yeah, I think a lot of what ended up happening in the case discussions as well shows that I guess the people in government don't actually super understand the questions that they're asking either. I guess just like a lot of badgering to the creator of TikTok as to if he is a Chinese citizen. I don't think that should be the reason to ban TikTok, but there definitely are a number some of reasons as to why you should ban TikTok. So yeah, that's why I think this motion should exist independent of that. And likewise, I think specifically in the United States, because there is like, I guess, it really changes the nature of the debate because you're in this country. It would be super different if it were to be this house would ban TikTok in, I don't know, a much smaller third world country with less media access. So yeah.
I was gonna say the Philippines until you said with less media access. Because Filipinos are one of the top users of social media in the world. But
Yeah.
so like just to be safe, okay, things might change from what day is it today? Today is April 10. We are recording this on April 10. It does get banned in the United States at any time between now and the time that we run this motion for debatable open. We're gonna change the motion from this house would ban TikTok in the US to this house celebrates the ban on TikTok in the US. It's okay with you, Charlie.
Yeah, yeah, sure, sure.
Okay, so you mentioned that, independently of the borderline racist hearings, the congressional hearings, there are really compelling reasons to ban TikTok in the United States. Can you tell me a little bit more about those reasons that Gov might bring up for this motion?
Yeah. So I guess I'll name like three, maybe five at the top of my head. I guess first is like disinformation and censorship. It's so easy to misinform people on TikTok for a bunch of reasons on the censorship aspect when BLM tags were blocked. And I think you can really tell that it was what's the word for this? Like an intentional block because they blocked both hashtag BLM and hashtag Black Lives Matter tags. So yeah, that's one thing. I think also given the algorithms, users are also more prone to getting one side of the discussion on certain matters. I remember there was a lot of content on TikTok that, and I guess going back to court cases here, that really made this high profile Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp case make Amber Heard really look like the only person in the wrong. And I think just the nature of trials like that try to make people look really bad, right? For legal strategy. And I think the way TikTok presented it to people, really invalidates the experiences of women here, has led to a lot of victim blaming, etc. So stuff like that. I think that's one thing TikTok can definitely do. Also, just the nature of something that's short form content. I think they have changed their video time limits over the last few months or over the last few years or something. It
Yeah,
used to be
you can
10
do.
or 15. Now it's like 60 or something.
Oh, not 60? I was gonna say 10 minutes.
Oh,
60.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Sorry, I was gonna say 6 seconds. So it used to be
Oh,
max 60 seconds at one point, and now it's 10 minutes. And I'm just like, wow, so what is a short form video these days, right? But not everyone opts for that. So there's a lot of part twos, there's a lot of misinformation, and because people try to challenge the algorithm, they really try to, like, say things in a specific way that would really just hook people. And the only way to hook people sometimes is to phrase it a certain way that causes drama, that causes scandal, that starts so outrageous or something. So yeah, I think a lot of it is rooted in the algorithm. Another thing that I would name on Gov is just selling user data to China, where the company has paid the US and South Korea like large amounts, which what's the word for this? For collecting information from children without parental consent. If I'm not mistaken, I watched this polymatter video on YouTube. For the United States, it's around 5 million. For South Korea, it's around 1,000, like 150,000 and stuff like that. And even data from their content creators and stuff like that. But obviously, I guess like for this case, the children aspect would be a much more compelling example to give. Just the essence of privacy as well is a big discussion where it gets so much data from people for its algorithm to work. People will mitigate this by saying there are terms and conditions, but honestly, no one reads that. It's not enough. Admittedly, I think there also has been a lot of proof that TikTok has been collecting way more than it discloses. And at some point, everything does become so public on TikTok as well, with the way people use the app, that there are just so many creeps on that app that also target women and children. I'd also ban TikTok for mental health, again, because of how addicting this algorithm is. People mindlessly scroll every day. There's probably some scientific explanation to it that I think is very much available online. And I think opposition does have room to say that if you ban it, yeah, it'll just strengthen competition that's rising right now, like YouTube and Instagram Reels. But I guess it's a discussion for the rest of the debate. And I guess something that I would say in terms of long-term effect on Gov is restructuring, where a US ban on TikTok would require the app to become, to restructure itself. Something that definitely has more ethical policies, more privacy protection, and isn't as harmful to other people. And that's a lot to restructure. That I don't know if the app would still be as successful as it is if it were to restructure these things. But because of how major the US user base is, then I think you can definitely say that banning it would be a first step into turning this into a better app. So yeah, things on Go.
yeah. So that's a lot. And like I was writing some stuff down and I'm like, I have a really great anecdote for this one. I have a really great anecdote for another point. But I would say, like, I realized from listening to you just now was about when you said they're selling user data to China. What I remembered here was actually China itself banned TikTok for their own citizens. So I think on Gov, it's possible that you can say, like, the privacy and security concerns are so big that even China says that it's not something that we should be allowing for our citizens. Although, what I would also say here is it's more likely that China banned it because it's full of Western propaganda and not specifically because they want to protect, the privacy of their citizens. But lastly, one of my absolute favorite bits of trivia is with respect to terms and conditions, which you mentioned earlier, because I made it a practice to read terms and conditions for everything that I enter into. Close to around 98% of people really don't read the
Yeah.
policies, terms of service policies. And some people say that's the biggest lie on the internet. And so my favorite piece of trivia that I want to bring up here is in 2017, there was a study conducted where they made like a fake website or something with terms and conditions. And hidden in those terms and conditions is if you click agree, you are selling your firstborn child. So those are very difficult, even outside of TikTok. But I think Golf can make an argument that TikTok is so big right now. Like it's so big. It's like there's a huge amount of peer pressure that you're going to be experiencing telling you that you should be on TikTok because otherwise you'd be missing out on huge portions of internet culture. And so it's more likely that these terms and conditions, these gotcha clauses will just push on through. So your contribution code. That's my contribution for golf. I don't want to belabor like the point for golf because there are just so many points you brought up already. So I want to move the conversation now opposition. What arguments can you imagine opposition would be making in support of TikTok, or at the very least, in opposition to a ban on?
Yeah, so I think honestly, I don't think I would have set this motion in all circuits of debate. That is to say that I think a lot of I guess like I'd say the Philippines seems very pro TikTok, and that's why I think this motion works. Although I do think there's a lot of room to say that you shouldn't ban TikTok as a whole, but there are ways at which you can restructure TikTok be better, especially in terms of privacy. And I don't think it's a type of restructuring that you can do all at once. I think op should be willing to concede to that. But I do think there are ways of improving the app. That's a possible case in op. I also think that because the motion is tied to the United States specifically, I think there is a lot of ways to deal with the whole censorship and disinformation thing. I think at the end of the day, if there are ways to block misinformation the way that you could report misinformation on Twitter, much easier, honestly. I think that's also something to look into, where there is still a burden for people to refer to more reliable news sources. And in the same way, how a lot of other social media platforms do have that wrong information there. And yeah, like I think there are just a lot of steps to take. And the thing that you would say for a lot of this House would ban motions is banning isn't the first step to take.
So instead, would it be okay for opposition to have a counter policy where they say, let's have divest instead? Like those problematic actors who sell data and stuff like that, let's have them divest from the company. Or perhaps like make them do an IPO or an initial public offering so that TikTok can be publicly traded. Would that be a good counter policy for all?
I agree that definitely the op counter policy should cover the data issue and not just the misinformation and censorship thing. Yeah, I guess like it's up to their strategy as to what they think is the best option is, but definitely if it's something that would cover, why sorry, what would stop them from selling this data, then I think that's something to definitely go for. If it means associating with a different company or restricting transactions with ByteDance or something, then I think that's, just like a few things for them to look into and opt.
Yeah. So aside from that, which is basically like let's mitigate a lot of the harms of golf, what is a uniquely good benefit that TikTok provides for not just the public in general, but specifically to the American public? Like if you're going to try to nuance it to US politics and the way of life in the United States, how would you go about that on op?
I think people are lazy. And why TikTok is so addicting is that everything's there because of this algorithm that you don't know how much it knows you. But at the same time, like the shows that you like watching are there. The discourse that you follow is there. Those Reddit posts that you also end up following are there. Maybe played over like some AI voiceover and some funny looking video game, but like it's there. I think that's definitely something to say that it's allowed people to be updated with discussions to an extent that they weren't before. And I know that people will say that these are things that you can get off of Facebook and Twitter. But honestly, I think it's just the fact that these platforms are dying. Sorry, Facebook and X. These platforms are dying, even Instagram. And Definitely, it's debatable. Frame what caused them to die, if it's the rise of TikTok per se, or if they were just naturally dying. So I think the fact that you're able to keep people in the loop with so much information, whether that be video content, text content, or, literally anything, that's something that TikTok does that no other platform has managed to do. And that's why it's also become so powerful. Whether or not it's a good thing, I guess that's not for me to say. But I think whether or not the trade-off is worth it. I think that's definitely something Op can raise because it's a matter of would they have reached this information otherwise, right? Yeah, like talking to kids, like people under the age of 11 or something, they're updated with a lot of things. Maybe not as deep as you'd like them to. Some things, definitely aren't accurate, but they're updated with things and they get to integrate themselves into this discussion. And if you count that as a first step, then yeah, I think that's something to note. Maybe Op has room to say that it's not like all of their information would be coming from these platforms. Because when you consume something, you're probably likely to use that information elsewhere, like in conversations with other people. So yeah, just I guess be careful about framing it as if you're supporting fake news. Yeah.
Yeah, what I would say is like it's really, really possible that if you learn something that might be misleading or fake news type, like on TikTok, and you use it in a day-to-day conversation, and it turns out to be false, that is also a point of discussion that you could have with your friend or your conversation partner. And so basically the fact that you are entering into conversations with other people, that is an opportunity for the fact checking to happen. So while the misinformation might spread really fast, the chances that people will just believe it and stick to it are not that high, especially considering that, if it gets really viral, then there will be an inevitable fact checking stitch or something like that. And that could also be a point for discussion. I also wanted to note that what you said earlier about Facebook and Twitter or X about it dying is uniquely true, possibly for the United States. Because as far as I know, in the Philippines, most people still get their news from Facebook. So that framing works only because we're talking about the United States. Yeah.
There's definitely Meta platforms and X dying for younger generations as well. And personally, that I can associate with TikTok. I think Facebook and X definitely dying with certain age groups, like my age group specifically. And yeah, I think that whole age group thing is something to talk about. Who are the generations likely on TikTok? I know it's probably a mix of people. In the Philippines, I know like some pretty aged people who are on TikTok, like even my aunts and uncles. But I know that in the United States, it's probably like a younger generation. And insofar as we're talking about how it is so believable for kids to consume information on TikTok, I guess Op might have the room to say something like, they're kids. If they say something wrong, it's still a point of discussion to make to potentially correct that kid. I think that just shows how this is something that could happen from anywhere. And banning isn't the solution to it. Like to totally take something out shouldn't be the immediate solution to something.
Yeah, I feel like the solution could be for the parent. You're like, oh, I'm so scared of my child learning about fake news and stuff like that. The solution there isn't to ban TikTok. It's to spend more time with your kids. It's to process
Yeah.
your like just be a better parent. Like it's difficult to be a parent, just full stop. But and so it's a very big ask to try to keep yourself updated on the things that your child is consuming online, but it's something, unfortunately, that you have to do because you're a parent, right? So that's my perspective. Like if ever I have a kid, I will always try to understand what a phantom tax is or what Riz is. But aside from all of these things, Charlie, is there anything that you want to add with respect to this third motion?
Definitely there are more things to say with with when time passes. For now, I'll keep it here.
All right. So I think that's it for this post-debate analysis. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you so much, Charlie, for agreeing to be our motion contributor for this set. We'll see you next time. Bye.